Bet the board.
What do you mean you don't bet? I mean, I don't bet. You know, I don't gamble. I don't. I never have, and I never will. Yeah, right. I'll bet you $20 I can get you gambling before the end of the day.
You owe me 15 grand, pal.
Pay him. Pay that man his money.
It's the Bet the Board podcast.
God likes me. He really, really likes me.
In the end, I wound up right back where I started. I could still pick winners, and I could still make money for all kinds of people back home. And why mess up a good thing?
Here's Payne Insider and Todd Furman.
Welcome into the Bet the Board podcast, part of the Wondery Podcast Network. It is the final episode of the college football season 2022, coming to an end with a national championship game at SoFi Stadium on Monday between the Georgia Bulldogs and the TCU Horned Frogs. I'm your host, Todd Furman, joined as always by my esteemed colleague and co-host, the one, the only Payne Insider. And for one of the first times this season from start to finish, Brad Powers joins us for the entire duration of the show. Brad, I normally give Payne the first word, but I'm going to give it to you. Are you ready for this after the Thanksgiving fiasco you endured just 6 weeks ago?
Yes, I am ready for this. And as always, guys, pleasure talking to you too.
Payne, any words, my friend? I mean, normally this is where you get to dance on the grave of every college football enthusiast, like guys like myself and Brad, because you don't have to talk about the sport going forward. But I get the feeling this season's been a little bit better for you. You've had a little more pep in your step with the Seminoles actually being nationally relevant.
Yeah, it helps. I actually had fun this year. Bringing in Brad made me turn the game up another notch, and it was fun talking ball, and this was definitely the most fun I've had breaking down some college games this season. Actually, it's one of those things where, you know, you hit that little lull for a couple weeks, and you're like, man, when is the season going to end? And then all of a sudden you get on a little run, and it's like, boy, it's bittersweet. I don't want to see this
Brad,
thing
apparently all that we had to do was bring in a very talented transfer quarterback into our quarterback room and allow Payne to fight for his job, and it changes the entire dynamic, something that the Jets probably should have learned from the quotes that we saw from their offensive coordinator coming out yesterday. But, guys, before we get into the game, and obviously we're going to...
It's the opposite, Todd. We brought in the transfer quarterback, and now I'm running routes a little bit harder. That's
so
what
you went
happened.
through a whole position change on top of this? We took you away from playing quarterback? You're like Juice Williams for the Fighting Illini now. Next thing I'm going to learn, you're going to be returning punts in 2023.
Yeah, I'm too valuable to return punts or kickoffs.
I knew there had to be a caveat to all that. But plenty of college football news, guys, and wanted to pick your brain a little bit. As our listeners know, they're going to get a full in-depth breakdown of the Georgia TCU game, both on the offensive and defensive sides for all of that. But Brad, your Notre Dame Fighting Irish were aggressive. They went out and landed themselves a big-name starting quarterback in the transfer portal. Do we think Sam Hartman is going to be given the job from day one, or do we really believe Marcus Freeman's going to have a little quarterback battle to see who takes the reins in fall of 2023?
Yeah, he's not going to come out and say that Sam Hartman is now our starting quarterback, but, 99.9% Sam Hartman will be the starting quarterback for Notre Dame in 2023. The question is whether or not Tyler Buckner, who had some pluses and minuses as far as the bowl game. The question is, does he transfer or not? But, you don't bring in a guy like Sam Hartman, the all-time passing leader in the history of not only Wake Forest football, but the history of the ACC, and not expect him to be a starter from the outset.
Payne, does this make you by default a Notre Dame fan along with Brad? Because behind Stetson Bennett in the Payne power ratings, it's Stetson Bennett 1, which of course we'll get to. Then it's Sam Hartman 2, although I have to imagine Jordan Travis doing everything he can to bridge that gap and move himself out of third position.
I'm a Sam Hartman guy. I just think he's a good kid. It'll be interesting to see him navigating away from a little bit of a different system. But I got to tell you, I realized I was getting old when I tuned into the Notre Dame spring game and I saw Drew Pine wearing a belly shirt. And I'm like, this is just not my vibe. But apparently it was a trend among the young kids. Getting Sam Hartman in there, a little bit more mature guy who wears his jersey properly, is definitely a breath of fresh air. But I think what's interesting about that is just, it's a good mix. It's a good vibe. I think it's a perfect match personality-wise. Like, Sam Hartman, I like him just because he's a good dude. If you kind of follow that story where, kind of grew up and mom raised him a little bit and he's just super loyal, and I know Wake Forest fans don't want to hear that right now about his loyalty, but had the opportunity to play high school football a number of different places and chose to play with a coach that he knew very well, and that coach was building a program that was off one win the year prior, so he wanted to go help build that program. Just a good kid. Hopefully he finds himself in the NFL as a backup quarterback making a couple $1 million. That would be the ideal situation here, but I think it's a huge
That's all
upgrade
you
for
want
Notre
is
Dame.
these guys to get an opportunity, playing bigger schedules, playing against some of these marquee opponents, and Sam Hartman deserves a ton of credit for obviously the success the Demon Deacons program has had. You've seen Dave Clawson bring in guys that are consummate veterans and pros the way they conduct their business, and just another in the lineage there at Wake Forest, following in that Riley Skinner mode that we saw years ago. The other big story that I think is worth touching on as well, guys, is involving a team that obviously had their chance to get to the college football playoff, underachieved in terms of odds makers' expectations, and that would be the Michigan Wolverines, who lost outright to TCU as a 7.5, 8-point favorite. But it's not what's gone on the field since the Big Ten season ended. It's all of the stuff that's taking place around the status of Jim Harbaugh, some level 1 allegations, and what they may have to deal with. I have to imagine, Payne, that we've seen Jim Harbaugh coach his last game as member of the Maize and Blue.
Interesting. I think the rumors will definitely enhance pending the Miami Dolphins result this weekend. What's interesting here is we saw Harbaugh make a statement. I believe it was yesterday afternoon, and he effectively said, I believe the word was enthusiastically preparing for 2023 as a Michigan man, just kind of paraphrasing there. But you can see all of a sudden why Harbaugh had to make that statement and why rumors of Stephen Ross firing the Dolphins GM and head coach Mike McDaniel after one season, if they don't make the playoffs, are swirling around this week. And for me, the rumor has more steam with Michigan football receiving those allegations from the NCAA, of which there are 5 violations, one of which is that level 1 violation status, which I guess is on Jim Harbaugh directly for failure to cooperate with investigators. So we'll see what unfolds here, but this is definitely an interesting situation to monitor, and I think the steam only increases if Miami doesn't make the playoffs, beating the Jets
Perfect
this week.
Pete Carroll exit plan that we saw at Southern Cal back in the day, and Pete has done all right becoming an NFL head coach. Brad, your knowledge of the situation, obviously being a Notre Dame guy, there's no love lost for Michigan when you take a legacy quarterback as well away from Ann Arbor with a car coming to South Bend. But when you look at Michigan, and it's always so tough to speculate this far out, I mean, do you think they stay in the family if Harbaugh leaves, or are there some logical names that you could imagine being good fits to take over for the Wolverines?
That's a good question. At least from initial reading, and this is the last week as the rumors have been ramping up, not only, Payne has mentioned Miami, but there's Indianapolis, and obviously there's some correlation there with Harbaugh playing quarterback for the Colts. There's Denver, maybe some interest there with the Broncos. What I'm hearing is that there's going to be a promotion most likely, and that would be the offensive line coach, back-to-back Joe Moore award-winning offensive line. So I think they might go there, but, it's still a top 10 job as far as I'm concerned. So I think depending on how severe the allegations are and penalties are, it would probably, determine on who they could really get. But, yeah, if they want to go out and get a guy like a Shane Beamer or something like that, I could certainly see that. But I think they want to probably keep the ball rolling here and continuing the momentum of the last couple of seasons. So I think it might be just promoting one of the staff members.
And here I was thinking they would roll out the Brinks truck to try and bring Josh Gaddis back to town, given everything he did for the Miami offense this past season. But alas, apparently
Keep him down there.
Apparently not the case, and I'm not sure Shea Patterson has any eligibility left to be Michigan's starting quarterback. But so many interesting storylines. Normally we don't get those until after we crown a national champion, but this is the college football world where the news cycle is 365 days a year, with signing day and all of these programs trying to better position themselves as far as the transfer portal and everything else. But guys, those are only the appetizers, because the big order business is of course the national championship game, and that's Georgia taking on TCU Monday, January 9th from SoFi Stadium in Los Angeles, with Georgia a 12-point favorite in this football game, as high as 12.5, down a touch from where it opened in that 13.5 range. Total on the game sits at 63.5. And just to kind of build the scene for this contest, Georgia is seeking to be the first repeat national champion since 2011-2012. The previous 4 champions in the playoff era all lost in the title game when they were looking to try and defend their crown. A straight season that the SEC has had a team playing for the title. The first time the Big 12 will send a representative to the final. Meanwhile, TCU seeks to be the first Big 12 team to win a national champion since Vince Young and the Texas Longhorns accomplished the feat back in 2005. TCU won national championship in the poll era. That came back in 1938 before any of us were around, and most likely a lot of our listeners. Since then, the Horned Frogs have finished in the top 5 of the AP poll just twice. 2010, they finished second, and in 2014, they finished third. Meanwhile, Georgia can join 2018 Clemson and 2019 LSU, both 15-0, as the only FBS team since 1990 to win 15 games in a season. We know about the recruiting. We know about 1890. All right, so there we go. So I'm dating myself a little bit here. I got to go even further back in the annals. Brad, we know about the talent disparity. We can look at the recruiting rankings. We know you have to fit a certain formula typically to win a national championship in college football, and TCU doesn't check those boxes. But I think the most logical place to start, as we've done with a lot of the big games this year, is going through the power number in terms of what you make this game now versus how these teams have arrived at this point in the season in terms of the way they're viewed in the betting space.
So first off, I'm a very self-deprecating guy. I went back. I bet a lot of season win totals this offseason. I bet TCU under 7. So how smart am I? But the expectation, and that was kind of an outlier number that I bet there. Most of the market had them Payne at 6.5. I didn't even have TCU in the top 40 of my power ratings. There was obviously going to be a lot of staff turnover, schematic changes, particularly on offense for them. But no question about it. I mean, I've upgraded TCU as much as any Power 5 team in the country besides Duke. They've went from 46 to 6 in my power ratings as far as a ranking, plus 11.5 points, meaning TCU right now would be favored over 11.5 points over what I perceived them to be in the summer. So significant upgrade there. Georgia, believe it or not, also an upgrade. The team that I didn't expect to repeat as the champ, just because of the losses that they've had. So they went from number 3 to number 1 in my power ratings. So upgrade for both teams, but TCU a massive upgrade.
Brad, normally I wouldn't ask questions like this because I don't like to put people on the spot, but I know you keep logs of absolutely everything, and with the myriad of media responsibilities you've done this season, I imagine you've been asked this question before. How would you power rate last year's national championship Georgia Bulldogs team versus this year's Georgia Bulldogs national championship team?
Yeah, Georgia 4 right now. What would be the point spread of course, Georgia 4. Last year's Georgia team 4 over this year's Georgia team.
It's pretty wild. I mean, when you look at everything that they lost on the defensive side of the ball, we knew how elite that group was versus what Kirby Smart has been able to do. And Payne, when we begin to try and assess this game, we saw both semifinals were among the top 5 highest scoring games in college football playoff history. All 4 teams scored more than 40 points. So gone are the days of trying to win these football games 12-9. But when you look at Georgia, they played a high-powered offense earlier this season in the Tennessee Volunteers, and they look to be significantly more buttoned up in that particular spot than what we saw last week against Ohio State, because when C.J. Stroud had time in the pocket, and he's got a lot of NFL-caliber offensive linemen, they were able to pick apart the Georgia secondary. So for me, I think Georgia's calling card has always been on the defensive side. It's very much Kirby's DNA, and that probably makes the most sense as a place for us to start with the Georgia defense against the TCU offense. Max Duggan, hey, look, he's exceeded everyone's expectations. This is a kid who wasn't even the starting quarterback when they kicked off at Folsom Field against Colorado week 1. It was a Chandler Morris injury that opened the door. Duggan finishes against Michigan 14-29, does connect on the big plays. But when you look at the Georgia defense matched up against the TCU offense, do you see an edge that TCU can exploit or somewhere where Georgia can really pick apart TCU and put them behind the 8 ball?
I actually think you made a good little comparison there, and you hinted at it. I think, the most basic comparison for what Georgia will see from TCU's offense feels like a substantially less wealthy version of Tennessee with Hendon Hooker. You kind of look at some of those similarities where TCU wants to spread you out. They want to hunt the explosive, and they're going to run into light boxes, and they're going to run with their quarterback, which creates that advantage in the box, especially when you're playing light. So from an offensive principle standpoint, TCU and Tennessee are very similar. And you go back to that Georgia matchup against the Vols, they held Tennessee to 3.5 yards per play below their season-long average. So I think seeing Tennessee's offense helps a little bit here, especially when you don't have that, extended month off of prep. The difference to me leading up to the national championship game compared to what we discussed, I think it was last week or whenever we broke down TCU Michigan, is that Georgia's defense is a little bit of a different animal, obviously. And if you go back and listen, the one thing we said was like, sure, you can look at Michigan metrically and see they're a top 15 defense in both rushing success rate allowed and EPA per rush allowed. But if you dive deeper, Michigan was outside the top 50 in yards per rush allowed before first contact, which is, wildly more predictive for stopping the run. Michigan was outside the top 80 in that same metric when you play with a light box defensively. And again, that's something TCU forces you to do with their spread and their air raid. Georgia doesn't mind being put in that position, right? They like playing with a light box because Kirby thinks his guys are good enough up front. And so they play with a light box on, 25% below expectation. And if you look at TCU's offensive line, like man for man, it isn't great, especially at tackle. TCU is able to run because of scheme. But you look at Georgia, they're 8th in running back contact rate at or behind the line of scrimmage. They're 1st in yards per rush before first contact allowed. So Georgia's a little bit of a different beast defensively than Michigan when it comes to the ground game. And then Kendre Miller. Like, is he 100%? Does he actually play with that knee injury? So suddenly TCU's run game, for me, isn't nearly as potent when you think about it that way. I think it, will put more pressure on Max Duggan, and I thought Duggan played horrifically in the semifinal against Michigan, if I'm being candid, right? 40 passer rating from a clean pocket, 30% adjusted accuracy and when under pressure, and I think Duggan's going up in class here. And, the one thing that's interesting to me, and I think you'll hear about it all week, about Georgia needs to get pressure. And I think, sure, that's obvious. Like, defenses play better when they get pressure. But the one thing that we said last week, and it sounds like Michigan fans were shocked about it, they couldn't get pressure, Michigan. But TCU's scheme makes it hard to get home, right? It's what we specifically said. It's hard to get pressure with how quickly TCU throws it. Max Duggan throws with 0 or 1-step drops or RPOs on nearly 45% of his dropbacks. And Georgia doesn't create pressure in those situations overly well. 19% pressure rate on dropbacks in those instances. We mentioned Nolan Smith being out, and Georgia's pressure rate went from top 15 to top 45 without Nolan on the field. His backup in Chaz Chambliss is questionable after hyperextending his knee against Ohio State. So it's possible that we're looking at a decent amount of snaps for two true freshmen playing on the edge for Georgia with Jalen Walker and Marvin Jones Jr. I know they're top 50 players in the 2020 recruiting cycle, but they're true freshmen playing in the biggest game ever. So I wouldn't expect Georgia to get a ton of natural pressure from the outside, but I think with how TCU's O-line plays, it does set up nicely for Jalen Carter to just, be a force and dominate on the inside because they like to kind of pull their interior linemen a little bit. When Georgia doesn't get pressure, and I think that's a little bit of maybe a bonus here for TCU, they dip outside the top 50 in yards per pass attempt. And in those instances, we got to have Quentin Johnson win some one-on-ones on the outside, hit a few explosives. If you look at Max Duggan, he grades out pretty well as a deep passer. Deep ball completion rate, 10% better than the national average. But I think where things might go a little bit awry here is the rest of Duggan's passing tree isn't overly efficient. It's why if you watch TCU offensively this season, I know they're very good, in totality, but they're actually outside the top 80 in schedule-adjusted passing success rate, and that basically gauges your ability to be better down to down. It's why we've seen TCU go through some droughts offensively in multiple games because Max Duggan isn't that efficient, short, intermediate thrower, much better pushing it downfield. TCU's offense just very much is built on being able to run on light boxes, Duggan's ability to stretch the field through the air with deep shots and then use his legs in either scripted runs or impromptu runs when a play breaks down. Suddenly, you start to think about this, boys. Like, if TCU can't run as efficiently against a light box, which, again, Georgia's pretty good at, and Kendre Miller isn't 100%, and my suspicion would be here, from what I'm hearing, as good as Quentin Johnson is, Kirby Smart's going to make someone else beat him, right? Have some help over the top. So it's extremely likely TCU's offense doesn't look close to a fringe top 5 offense here. Now, there is some variance because Georgia's defense really hasn't looked like itself the last 5 games, and you start to think about the time of year it is, and you lose 8 starters off last year's historic defense, and then you get hit by the injury bug, right? Nolan Smith and Dane Jackson are down. Suddenly, all that Georgia depth and talent is being tested here a little bit, but I think they match up pretty well against TCU, especially if Kendre Miller's down and Max Duggan plays like he played.
And you know what, to your point, Payne, Kirby didn't really shy away from some of his comments this week, talking about that youth and experience, despite it being the tail end of a freshman season for some very talented recruits, about doing some of the things complex that they would like to do to confuse a veteran quarterback. It was all about execution and going out there and making sure that they could play fast, that they could play downhill. When you look at Georgia, we know that they've been prone to giving up the big play as far as SEC ranks are concerned. I mean, they were 9th in the conference in pass plays of 10-plus yards. That number fell off a cliff when you're talking about even bigger plays at 30 or 40. But, Brad, one of the things that we saw Ryan Day and Ohio State do so well, albeit in the loss against Georgia, was moving C.J. Stroud around. Georgia never knew exactly where that release point was going to come from, but there's a major downgrade at quarterback from an NFL-caliber guy in C.J. Stroud that can make all the throws and did on the biggest stage versus what Max Duggan can do. If he's not able to get the ball out of his hand quickly, he's got to improvise and try and fit the football into tight windows.
But with that being said, certainly doesn't have the arm talent as a C.J. Stroud or the receiving core as far as a depth perspective as a C.J. Stroud. But Max Duggan is a guy that's capable of at least maneuvering around in the pocket if George is able to get some pressure, and more likely to do it in this type of situation, because we've actually seen Max Duggan, run around a little bit more the last 2 games. Big 12 championship game, playoff game, back-to-back games, 15 rushing attempts. That's the most he's had in any game this season, and I would expect more of the same. Not only style of play, but the fact that Kendre Miller, I'm guessing, last I heard, did not practice Wednesday. I am a little bit more pessimistic than a lot of people with that injury. So I expect Duggan to be running around a lot more. And I think there's some opportunity. That young Georgia secondary is going to have to be disciplined. I haven't seen that the last two games. Now, let's put the Ohio State game aside. I think probably the better comparison would be the LSU game. And look, Georgia was, you guys pointed out, attacked the first half. Georgia gets out to a big lead. But man, in that second half with a backup quarterback and LSU's wide receiver core, wasn't great in my mind this season. They were able to, Nussmeier was able to throw the ball down the field consistently against Georgia. So I think there's a pathway to some success there with Duggan running around. But, just straight up, being able to run the ball and being able to play the way TCU has played all season, I do have my doubts there.
Yeah, I think it's so fascinating because you look at Georgia, and obviously you want to look at the entire snapshot. So you can take a data point that we've referenced multiple times here about how good they were against the pass and taking on Tennessee in a game in Athens. But over the last 2 contests, when you look at this Georgia defense, they entered the game allowing a shade less than 13 points per contest and less than 300 yards per game. But over the last 2 games, the LSU game that you just referenced, Brad, and of course what we saw against Ohio State, they've now given up 71 points and over 1,000 yards, something that we never would have had to factor into the equation with the Georgia defense that already has a national championship to their credit. So many fascinating storylines to follow. You mentioned Quentin Johnston. Payne, obviously Georgia going to be best served to neutralize him, make guys like Darius Davis, Tay Barber, and some of the other talented receivers TCU have that aren't quite those NFL caliber talents go out there and beat you if they're going to have some success come Monday night.
Let me ask you guys something, because it's a little bizarre, and Todd, you brought it to my attention, and Brad just kind of refreshed my memory there. Max Duggan's rushing prop opened 30.5 down to 27.5. If Kendre Miller's out and you're going to see a game script where the spread indicates you're going to have to be throwing a bunch, how do you get to... I don't understand. Who's betting that thing under? He had 13 rushing attempts in the Michigan game.
I think the real...
It's bizarre to me.
The real challenge with that, Payne, is when you look at how TCU played in a win against Texas, he finished the game with negative 41 rushing yards just because he was under duress the whole time. And so it leads you to believe if you
Right.
get one, 8 to 10 yard sack, how much bigger a mountain does he have to
Right.
climb to be able to get over that total? It's the only thing that I can understand in terms of why this thing is coming down. But you raise an excellent point. Yes, on the surface, Georgia's going to be able to generate pressure, but they weren't able to get home last week against Ohio State. And if TCU's not letting Duggan sit in the pocket for 3 to 4 seconds and survey, it's getting the ball into his hands and getting it out. There are going to be some design runs for him to chance to pick up chunks at a time.
Yeah, I mean, there was 13 runs, whether designed or impromptu, in the Michigan game for 63 yards, and I mean it was interesting to me to see that get buried under, especially when you just kind of look at Georgia's ability to get pressure without Nolan Smith, and kind of what we referenced there with how quickly Max Duggan gets rid of it, and Georgia's ability to get pressure in those instances really hasn't shown itself. So, and then you might have some young guys playing at defensive end. So I thought that was interesting. We'll see what materializes moving forward. Obviously, the prop market is not open everywhere. The limits are not very flush.
Could be some manipulation there too.
We'll see.
I mean,
yes,
flagged accounts.
yes.
They want to make one
Completely
last push
agree.
to get some money. So manipulate the market, and then when people do open up, then they attack. I agree with you. I would lean over.
Yeah, I haven't bet it yet. We'll see what this looks like on Monday, when I think a lot of us will maybe start attacking.
Yeah, well, I want to get to the other side of the ball, obviously. But, Brad, I mean, I feel like Payne set us up perfectly because you are the college football guy here. When you look at prop markets, we know that some books have gotten a little bit more aggressive, not so much during the course of the regular season, although there is a shop out here in the desert that'll take a 4-figure bet on a college football prop for some of the marquee games. Are they an area where you spend any semblance of time during the regular season, or maybe more so in just the college football semifinals and championship, knowing that it's actually the juice becomes worth the squeeze at this point in the year?
Yeah, good question as always. I don't spend much time until it gets to the playoffs. I just don't, and maybe I should. Maybe there's a lot of positive EV, but you got to keep in mind that I already have a lot on my table as far as FCS and FBS, and I'm a guy that's betting almost every single game, side or total. So it's something I don't attack, and it's something I would if I was in another state, just because there's only one shop here that really has a market for player props. Other states, different story. 3-4 different shops that have it. So that would be my philosophy would probably change if I moved out of the great state of Nevada.
You can follow Brad on Twitter. That's at BradPower7. You, of course, can follow Payne there as well, at Payne Insider. I'm Todd Furman. Most importantly, follow the podcast at BetTheBoardPod. And gentlemen, obviously, there's two sides of every coin. We talked about the TCU strength offensively against the strength of the Georgia football team, what they typically bring home every Saturday on the defensive side. But I think as a result, Georgia's offense is the group that oftentimes gets undersold. And we saw that on full display as they erased that late deficit against the Buckeyes in the national semifinal, coming back down 2 touchdowns to outscore them 18-3 in the final stanza. And when you look at Georgia, they have the best yardage differential in the country this season. They've outgained their opponents by 2,665 yards. They've outgained their opponent in every game this season except the SEC championship win over LSU, but we know score effect played such a big role in that particular contest. Number 9 scoring offense in the FBS, 92 points in 2 postseason games and over 1,000 total yards in their wins over LSU and Ohio State. And Payne's guy has stepped up to the plate when he's been asked to. You look at what Stetson Bennett has done in the semifinal, 23 of 34, 398 passing yards, 4 total touchdowns, career high in passing yards in that game. But most impressively, 10 of 12 in that fourth quarter, 190 passing yards and 3 touchdowns. He's been named the MVP in each of Georgia's last 4 postseason games. Payne, Stetson Bennett doesn't get enough credit for what he's meant to this Georgia program as a stabilizing influence under center. Are you buying stock in your man in what will be his final college football game on Monday?
First of all, what the hell's going on? Bet the Board headquarters here saw a bunch of notes come in with some hatred towards Stetson Bennett. It feels like everyone's yelling about his age now that Ohio State and their first-round quarterback couldn't beat him. Everyone's throwing stones at Stetson Bennett. What's going on?
Stetson Bennett may make a great quarterback in the CFL someday if that's how he elects to go about it, rather than being a tax auditor working for Jackson Hewitt.
Jeez. He'll never have to buy a steak dinner in the state of Georgia, though.
That is a very good point.
Jeez, I didn't understand the hate. I think when you talk about how to attack a TCU defense, the first thing that you have to discuss is their 3-3-5, and it's kind of the mindset that defenses use to stop high-powered Big 12 passing attacks, and it's also a really smart formation to use when you can't land 4- and 5-star defensive linemen, because there's more good linebackers than elite linemen, and so that's what TCU does. And I think if you go back to that Michigan game after the initial explosive for Donovan Edwards, TCU did a really, really good job kind of neutralizing Michigan's O-line. We talked about them not seeing that defensive look this season, and TCU did a good job kind of fitting gaps quickly, and then they flowed over the top and they forced Edwards and guys to bounce it outside, which is what TCU wants you to do, right? I mean, TCU's whole goal is to kind of plug that middle and force you outside and use their speed strength, and that's kind of what TCU's built on. But I think what's interesting is, one guy that I think we'll talk about, and I think sharp guys will talk about, but it's really a key to this game in my mind, is we have to keep tabs on Darnell Washington's status. I think he's really vital to Georgia's zone run scheme. Kirby Smart came out and said it was a soft tissue injury and not a sprain, which is what a lot of people thought, and that was a good thing, and it makes it more likely that Darnell Washington could play. But let's kind of see how that unfolds from now until Monday, because look at Darnell Washington, 6th in terms of how good he is in terms of run blocking as a tight end. He's kind of that added lineman on the field. He's actually graded out Georgia's best run blocker on the team, if you can believe that. And you kind of look where Michigan was weak heading into that TCU game, right? It was tight end. That group was in horrific shape injury-wise, and I think that played a pretty big role in TCU being able to defend Michigan pretty well in spurts, and then obviously Blake Corum was out, so that helped a bunch. But I think, in this matchup, it's a little bit more difficult, because you look at Georgia, the ground game is really, really good. It's not flashy, and so I think people don't understand how good it actually is, and that's a good matchup for Georgia there, right? TCU's 95th in contact rate of running backs at or behind the line of scrimmage. TCU's bottom 15 nationally in yards per rush before first contact. Georgia does a really good job being physical and kind of leaning on you. And again, like, Georgia doesn't have that home run hitter at tailback, but they can kind of chunk you. And the Dogs are top 5 in yards created before first contact. Georgia's fringe top 10 in terms of schedule-adjusted rushing success rate. More than 53% of runs have graded successful. So whether it's DeJuan Edwards or Kenny McIntosh, I think both run hard, both fall forward, both average more than 6 yards per rush against light boxes, which is what you'll see against TCU. In terms of, Stetson Bennett and Georgia's passing attack, I think that's pretty interesting, because they found a gear I think none of us knew they actually had, right? They were playing from behind, and Georgia was able to hit 8 passing plays of 20-plus yards. That was more than double their season-long average. The receiver group, aside from Ladd McConkey and then obviously Darnell Washington as a pass catcher at tight end, appears pretty healthy here. Where the real advantage, I think, for Georgia is, and I don't think, it's a situation where, again, like, Stetson Bennett's getting crapped on here, but I don't think Stetson Bennett sees much pressure. I mean, you just kind of look at what the Dogs front does. Very good in pass protection, top 10 in schedule-adjusted pressure rate surrendered. They moved my guy Mims to right tackle, and he's just kind of flourishing there right now. And you look at TCU outside the top 100 in generating pressure. TCU outside the top 50 in creating havoc. So it's going to allow Georgia to be in these favorable down and distances. Georgia's an offense top 15 in both early down EPA rate and the rate in which they pick up first down on early downs. TCU defensively outside the top 50 in both. So it just feels like a situation where Georgia could be just operating from real manageable situations, where it's going to be run or pass, which makes it a little bit more difficult to defend, obviously. And then, I think J.J. McCarthy is a better talent than Stetson Bennett, but I think Bennett's far more battle-tested. He's been in bigger games, and when you can rally your team in a championship setting against Nick Saban last year, and then do it again against Ohio State a week ago, I think that fear factor's gone. And the one area where I think if you go back to what we discussed last week, TCU's 3-3-5, we thought it would give Michigan a little bit of trouble based upon how J.J. McCarthy fared against defenses that played more guys in their secondary. Now, I don't think any of us expected 2 pick sixes, but McCarthy's splits were pretty alarming against defenses that played with 5 or more defensive backs on the field. It's the complete opposite for Stetson Bennett. There's no drop off. In fact, like when you look at defenses that use 5 DBs on the field like TCU does, Bennett's completion percentage 8% higher. Bennett's rate of positive EPA plays increases 13%, and somehow there's no dip in Bennett's yards per pass attempts when seeing 5 defensive backs or more. So the key here for Georgia, right, is Bennett can't let himself get fooled, right? He got away with a couple bad throws against Ohio State. Ohio State didn't really capitalize, but he has to kind of take what TCU gives him, find the open man. He's going to be operating with little to no pressure if the metrics are any indication. There isn't a reason to force a ball and make a mistake and give TCU life in a game I don't think they probably should be in. And that's kind of where Georgia has some edges here, but I do think keeping an eye on Darnell Washington is important.
You mentioned the Georgia receiving room, and obviously health has played such a big role in all of that. Ladd McConkey, their number one threat for most of the season, dealing with some knee tendonitis. But to Georgia's credit, we always talk about the rich getting richer, and it's Arian Smith, yet to play more than 20 snaps in a game all season, making splash plays to help that Georgia passing attack show the big play potential. And meanwhile, Mitchell, his running mate there, played a season-high 49 snaps in one of the last 2 games as well. So you're talking about Georgia getting more playmakers out on the field right when they need them. Brad, when you look at this TCU team defensively, I get the feeling they get largely undersold. I know what the season-long numbers suggest from a scoring defense standpoint. They're outside the top 50 in scoring defense, total defense, yards per play, rush defense, and pass defense. But we've seen them step up when they've been asked. The Texas game is one of the first things that come to mind when they go into hostile territory, and they look like the steel curtain. And for stretches of that Michigan game when they needed to make big plays, mainly for the first 30 minutes, it was the defense that raised their level of play in sparking them to a 21-6 halftime lead. When you try and assess TCU's full body of work defensively, does it feel like just a boom or bust type unit?
It does. Boom or bust, not only on a game-by-game basis, but during a game, it feels like. Obviously, you got to give them some credit. I mean, not only the pick sixes, but they were able to get pressure more than I expected against Michigan. Dylan Horton played the game of his life, has 4 sacks in the Michigan game. Linebackers making plays. D. Winters made a bunch of plays in that game. But obviously, Bud Clark from the free safety position. The question I have, and Payne's kind of hinted at it, I don't see how TCU holds up in the run game. I think they're going to have to commit somebody else up front there. They don't have great size. They do have a 320-pound nose guard, but the 2 defensive ends, aren't sitting there, 275 range. I don't see how they hold up at the point of attack. Do they have to bring in, a guy like Mark Perry, the strong safety, into the box, the run support? You guys mentioned, Georgia getting healthier at wide receiver, just in time with McConkey banged up, Washington banged up. That if they didn't have A.D. Mitchell and Arian Smith stepping up last week for the first time, and it felt like months, I'm not sure that they win that game. But the fact that they're healthy now, I think they can split out some more guys on that outside and make TCU have to decide if they're going to support that pass game for Georgia or creep a guy into the box. I know they've had some moments, particularly the Texas game stands out because we were involved heavily on that game, and to me that's more of the outlier, that they held Texas to 28 rushing yards. Since that game, last 4 weeks, TCU's allowing nearly 200 rushing yards per game. That is not national title contender, at least screams it to me. And even a Michigan team that, had that big chunk play early with Donovan Edwards, and, the stats look good there, but, obviously Michigan was behind and really couldn't lean on their ground game after they're behind multiple scores for a majority of that game. So if TCU doesn't get out to a big lead, I don't see the pathway for their defense. I think it's more bust in this, at least in this matchup.
And you mentioned the Georgia ground game. I mean, a trio of backs all with 500-plus rushing yards this year, the only team in the FBS to accomplish such a feat. with Kenny McIntosh, DeJuan Edwards, and Kendall Milton. So, Payne, I'm going to put your feet to the fire here. If you're Joe Gillespie and you're in that defensive room with TCU trying to scheme up a game plan, what are you trying to take away first and foremost? Are you just trying to send 8 guys to take away the run and force Stetson Bennett to beat you over the top, or is it going to be death by 10,000 paper cuts, allowing Georgia to run into those light boxes, hoping that you're able to let them move the football between the 20s and try and hold them to field goals in the red zone?
Yeah, it's a loaded question, and I think Todd Monken does a really good job. And again, we find out that Georgia has something in its repertoire that we didn't know they had with those 8 big passes last week. And so now all of a sudden you got the ground game going, you got the horizontal play action game going with your tight ends, and now all of a sudden you can push the ball downfield as well. And so it becomes very difficult. And the other thing that we have to think about here is everything was perfect for TCU last game, as Brad alluded to, and you had almost a month to make that game plan defensively. Now you're a little bit, I wouldn't say on a short week, but you're on a regular week, so you just don't have as much time. And in games like this, I think it's interesting, the outside world might not know this, but staffs like Alabama, staffs like Georgia, they're going to have 50 analysts. TCU may have 20. And so sometimes there's a little bit of a hidden advantage with coming up with the right scheme and the right game plan, and it tips itself in a little bit of a favor to these larger programs. This is what's difficult for me, because give TCU all the credit in the world. They went box to wire against Michigan, had double-digit leads 2 different times, but the magic continued a little bit, right? It's 2 defensive touchdowns. You hold Michigan to 0 points on 2 trips to the TCU, 2 and 1 yard line there. And then, held Michigan to field goals on 2 more trips to the 23 and 3 yard line. And then the other thing that we talk about a lot is the variance downs. TCU goes 8 for 16 on 3rd and 4th downs. Michigan goes 3 for 15 on those same downs. So they crushed high leverage situations. Michigan plummeted. And it just kind of everything went that way. And so, I think there's times where games go completely different than what we discuss, but I didn't think TCU Michigan was one of them. And whether it was the price, where we all said that this was the first time in a while our numbers showed a touch of value on TCU at 8.5, or we thought it was at least fair. We talked about the key for TCU is to make J.J. McCarthy beat you, and you had to do that by either building a lead or stopping the run. And once the score was 14-3, it just puts the onus on J.J. McCarthy in the biggest game of his life, and it also felt like Michigan didn't know what it wanted to be offensively. Who was the go-to guy? Corum was out. Tight end room was decimated by injury. Receiver room isn't necessarily Michigan's team strength. The defense was, faced with the task of jumping up in class for a second time all season, and the opposing offense had a month to prepare, and still it took everything for TCU to be here, right? And it was an easy cover. So from a betting standpoint, again, TCU plus 8.5 was the right side. It was something I know we discussed on game day, Todd. We were pretty close, didn't get over the hump, unfortunately. But speaking strictly about advancing to the championship, everything went TCU's way, including, even Jim Harbaugh not being overly great with decisions and clock and game management. And so, I think what we witnessed there was everything went TCU's way to win. And kind of bringing it back to this matchup, Georgia played an elite Ohio State team and won despite playing poorly. And so, I looked at this game and I thought, because of those 2 factors where TCU wins outright as an 8.5-point dog and Georgia finds itself down 14 in the 4th quarter, that we may actually get some value here on Georgia. My core number was Georgia minus 13.8. I was hoping for an opener at 9.5 or 10, which a lot of people speculated it could be. I would have been, double-handed shove there. But books opened 13.5, my same number. And it was kind of shocking to me because of how those 2 games played out, that we got no value in the number here. Now, it's interesting. I think we don't like talking about bet percentages and things like that. But in these big-time games, the public's out in full force. People that have never bet this season are out, and, they like the cuddly frog and the underdog and, right, all of those instances. And so it's kind of going to create this situation where hopefully waiting creates a little bit more value here on Georgia. So I was hoping and praying to be laying 10 here. A lot of sharp guys that I speak with got out and laid 7 in the first half, and maybe that's a discussion that we can talk about here, because I think, my mindset was Georgia's bigger in the trenches as as Brad alluded to, and this isn't a game where you have 28 days layoff where you can be refreshed, and you just wonder if, kind of leaning on TCU for the full game is the better. I don't know the best way to attack this, and that's ultimately why I haven't bet the game yet, although everything points to Georgia for me, both with a little value in the number now that we're as low as 11.5, and a lot of 12 in the market again made it nearly 14 here. I just haven't figured out the best way to attack
It's interesting on a variety of fronts because, when you talk about Georgia, if that's the side that you want to try and attack, we've seen Georgia go out there and take the life out of their opponents early in games. Tennessee, again, going back to that, perfect illustration. They knew what they had to take care of in Athens. They had an airtight game plan, and they basically sat on the lead. Tennessee had multiple chances to sneak in the back door before ultimately coming up a touch short at 27-13. And then to your point, you look at Georgia and you figure depth should be something that works in their favor. The recruiting rankings don't lie, and one of these teams has a lot more 4- and 5-star guys out there, especially on both the offensive and defensive line of scrimmage that can pay dividends in the fourth quarter. And it's what we've talked about for so many years, Payne, with Alabama. When you're looking at Alabama, people don't shy away from laying big numbers because when they're trying to run the clock out late in the game, those 3- and 4-yard carries become 8- and 9-yard gashers, and suddenly a 4-touchdown lead becomes 5 touchdowns and 6 touchdowns. So you wonder if Georgia will have a similar mentality. Brad, where do you kind of fall when you look at a game like this, if you're trying to make a case either for a first half or full game? Even if it's not the Georgia side, if it's TCU, do you feel that the Horned Frogs have to come out and land a couple of haymakers in the first 30 minutes, or given the perseverance that we've seen from them throughout the course of conference play, that they have shown an ability to battle back if they find themselves in an early deficit?
Yeah, I'm in more of the thought process that I expect Georgia to lean on TCU more in that second half, where the upstart underdog team maybe gives them a good fight for a little bit, but when it comes down to the point of attack in the line of scrimmage, I just don't see them holding up for a full 60 minutes. So I'm more intrigued by where this number goes because obviously we're sitting here at 12.5, kind of a dead spot. Does it creep closer to 10? Does it go back up closer to 14? And, Payne and you guys kind of asked me my thoughts prior to coming on here. And my answer is I don't know. I would like some of the Georgia people to be a little bit more patient because I do think it's one of those big events where people that only bet maybe 3 or 4 events a year, that they'll be involved. They're not going to be involved until game day. Hopefully there's some patience. And what they're going to want to bet is TCU, in my opinion. So I would hope that we get a better price on Georgia. So I'm kind of in wait-and-see mode. I do think Georgia's the right side here. I can tell you a bet that I have made is a team total Georgia over. I just look at what happened to Michigan. They're still able to put 45 on the board on TCU. They're inside the 2 twice, 0 points, and throw 2 pick sixes and still score 45 points. So I don't see a pathway to TCU's defense holding Georgia under a 37.5 team total. So I have made, I'm perfectly frank, open up about that bet that I made.
It's such an interesting game from a variety of fronts. This will be the largest number that we see in a national championship contest since Miami against Ohio State, where the Hurricanes closed as an 11.5-point favorite. Ohio State went out there, hit them in the mouth, and won that football game outright, much to the chagrin of Miami fans for the pass interference that was or wasn't. But so many different ways to attack a game of this magnitude, and I think you guys talking about market entry being so important, knowing that the public will have their say in what should be one of the most heavily bet college football games of the season. You see this number coming down a little bit in some shops, trending towards 11, others holding strong in no man's land in that 11.5 to 12.5 range, unwilling to go back to the 13, and I don't think there's any chance that we're obviously going to see a 14 or a 10. If the number does get to 14, it tells you all you need to know. Just bet Georgia and check the score 3.5 hours later. You should be able to have a winner in your pocket. Guys, we've covered, I think, every single angle that we know how to try and attack in this game. I guess the last question I have, mainly for you, Brad, more than Payne, do you have a strong opinion on the FCS championship on Sunday when the Dakotas do battle down in Frisco, Texas?
I wish I did. I don't. I made the number 4, so it should have me betting North Dakota State, but they are a banged-up team. This is not a North Dakota State team that's going to hold up, at least history-wise, compared to some of their other recent national championship teams. But it is a North Dakota State team that you're not, used to seeing with a plus sign next to their name as far as the betting markets. In fact, it's their biggest, underdog role in 6 years since they outright upset Iowa in 2016. So South Dakota State, though, is a team that there's no, fear factor involved. They're not going to be intimidated by North Dakota State. And why would they be? They beat North Dakota State each of the last 3 meetings. With that being said, South Dakota State's coach never won a championship. And I've seen moments in time where there's, I don't want to say panic, but I thought he was out-coached earlier already in this FCS playoff season against Holy Cross and Bob Chesney, and they still somehow covered the game. I worry if it's a one-possession game, and I do expect that to be the case. If that mentality, if South Dakota State has that dog in them to close it out and finally get over the hump. Because of that, I'm going to lean North Dakota State, but from everything I'm hearing, South Dakota State's going to take some more money here. So I'm not. If you're waiting to bet North Dakota State, wait till game day. I think you're going to get some more 6s available, maybe even a 6.5. I'm not sure that it ever gets to 7, but I'll have a pizza bet. I'll put it that way on North Dakota State here.
I mean, Brad, we blasted the NFL on our Pro Football podcast earlier this week about scheduling. I think the NCAA deserves a big fat 0 for the way they set this game up. Instead of making it the showcase game on Saturday, leading into what should have been the 2 big games on Saturday with the NFL, let's put it on Sunday and have it matched up against the NFL Week 18 slate at 2 o'clock Eastern, where only the diehards are going to watch. But I guess you can only lead a horse to water. You can't make it drink. And I'm hoping that there was some sort of scheduling conflict down there in Frisco at Toyota Stadium. That's the only excuse they possibly could have for putting this game Sunday, January 8th, instead of playing it on the 7th instead.
Couldn't agree more. It would have to be that. Otherwise, it makes absolutely no sense. With those 2 Saturday NFL games being on the same network as the FCS game, why is that not the noon or 1 o'clock start? I mean, dollars and cents, it makes no sense. Because you could get an audience, because this is the Ohio State-Michigan rivalry of the FCS. You could have gotten 1.5 million, 2 million people watching this game with nothing else on as far as a football perspective on a Saturday afternoon. Now I would be shocked if it got 1 million viewers.
It's just pretty wild the way they set all of these things up. But gentlemen, any final words of advice, wisdom you'd like to share? I know, Brad, you've been with us throughout the duration of the show. We'll let you take off before Payne and I put our heads together on the final order of business, but can't thank you enough again. And I know we've said it multiple times throughout the course of the season, the contributions you've made to Bet the Board to make not only Payne and myself smarter, but obviously raise the level of play, make our listeners that much more enlightened as they approach the handicapping process every single week throughout the course of the season. And we know for you, the work doesn't end as soon as they crown a national champion on Monday night. Those power ratings will go back into the lab. They'll get tweaked. You'll bust out the dot matrix printer, try and do all the accounting, maybe bring out the hammer, and get yourself ready for spring practice. That'll start up about 4 to 6 weeks down the road.
Yeah, there is no off season, not with today's climate of college football. But I've said this many times, gentlemen. This is the most fun I've had in my entire career doing a podcast. The pleasure was all mine, and I can't thank you guys enough for welcoming me to the Bet the Board podcast here.
You can follow Brad on Twitter at BradPower7, and just because college football has an end, the nuggets and tidbits that Brad shares through social media don't. So I want you to continue to interact with him throughout the course of the offseason. It's always bittersweet, Payne, when it comes to this portion of the final college football podcast of the season when we look to identify a best bet. And it's a tough act to follow, knowing that we were able to not only get CLV on Penn State, who went from a 3-point underdog to closing a short favorite. They get a dominant second half, albeit one where Cam Rising wasn't able to finish for Utah. So it's a tough encore in this particular spot and one of the more efficient numbers we're going to see. Last year in the national championship, I think the Boo Birds started to come from the hills when Georgia needed a comeback late in that game before they vanquished the demon that was Alabama. Where do we think the best opportunity is to make a little bit of money in the final college football game of the season?
So if you've listened to this podcast, because I think it's probably, as we talked about, it just felt like a good show. And I think that will end up being probably the best college football content anywhere based upon that breakdown that I just kind of heard back in my head. It felt like it flowed pretty well. But throughout the conversation, it was very much we like Georgia, but how do we bet it? When do we bet it? And so those are two key factors, right? Market entry is obviously very important. How to bet it, very important. I know we navigated the SEC championship game where we went Georgia in the first half. There is a potential wear down factor here with depth as well. So I think rather than try to rack our brain with the best possible way to bet Georgia, I think we just split one bet, call it a half a position each on Georgia first half -7, the other half position Georgia full game -12. Shop around. There's some 11.5 out there right now. I think ultimately the public is going to be, and I hate, again, talking about public, but this is a national championship game, and we talked about it a couple times. Brad mentioned it. TCU is kind of the beloved underdog here, and they keep cashing tickets for people. And so I think that sentiment's going to continue, and so it'll be interesting to see what this does on game day. But I do believe there is a well-sophisticated bettor that is going to be circling the waters here and coming in on Georgia at some point, which is going to influence some things. So I'm not sure where we go, right? Do we go down to 10? No. Do we go up to 14? I don't think so. Could be the more possible of the two movements. Just very difficult to navigate this, right? And so that's why, we're doing this on Friday morning. Personally, I'll probably be waiting on the full game here till Monday. That's just kind of how I'm viewing this. But just for the benefit of the listener here, I think we split it down the middle, one bet, and we just call it Georgia -7, Georgia -12 full game.
Stetson Bennett, we trust. I know it's going to be a sad, sad day in the Payne Insider household when Stetson Bennett finally hangs it up. He's been very good to us. I mean, you peeled back the curtain on his abilities and talent long before anybody wanted to believe in the guy, and a well-decorated career will most likely end Monday night with a second national championship, putting him in the pantheon of Georgia football greats. But my friend, it's been a hell of a season, buddy. From the college football previews that we started during the dog days of summer, I think way back in June, to understanding the marathon that it takes to produce content at such a high level and continue to raise the bar. So kudos to you for forcing me to raise my game as much as anything else, and hopefully we've been able to pass across a lot of nuggets, tidbits, and information to our listeners that they know they're not going to get anywhere else. And like we always do around the Bet the Board home offices, we'll come back next season with an even bigger and better product than we've ever put on the books thus far.
Yeah, it's been a long 6 months, but as I alluded to, I had fun doing college football this season. Brad was invigorated us both, and I think it sounds like he enjoyed it and told me he'll be back next season. So a lot to look forward to for our listeners. And, let's get out of Dodge. I know when we initially said, hey, let's do the national championship as an individual podcast, we were kind of scrambling on what we'd discuss. We're like, offensive side of the ball, defensive side of the ball, in and out 25 minutes. And then all of a sudden, Sam Hartman transfers to Notre Dame, Brad's beloved program. The Jim Harbaugh news came down, and it just didn't feel like any of it was forced to reach a certain minute milestone, so to speak, but here we are, and it looks like we're going to exceed an hour.
Hey, good work for us. We give people plenty of content that they have all weekend to try and comb through. Like we said, no Monday NFL podcast. We'll obviously circulate this again on social media on Monday as a reminder. So if you have to break it down, listen to one side of the ball early and the other side of the ball late. Take full advantage. Explore those prop markets. Try and exploit every single edge that you have readily available in the final college football game of the season. Thanks again to all of you.
Don't want to make any promises either. Don't want to make any promises. But sometime Monday, go to bettheboardpodcast.com. Maybe there's a player prop in there for you. Again, no promises. But there's a couple that seem to have some value for us. The market isn't completely open yet. Limits aren't as large as we'd like, so we're holding one or two back. We'll bet it. We'll see how much it moves. If there's still value, then we'll throw it on the website, bettheboardpodcast.com. You'll see this specific podcast atop the website. Just go into it. If there is a prop, again, for the third time, no promises, so don't berate us in our mentions on social media for one. It'll be there atop the podcast.
Yeah, and
description.
subscribe to the damn newsletter out there as well. All sorts of NFL great content from now until they hand out the Lombardi Trophy as well. But all kidding aside, thank you to all of you that have tuned in for the College Football Show each and every episode throughout the course of the season. We love creating content. We love the feedback, the interaction, and the relationships we're able to build with all of you. So best of luck with all of your investments in the national championship game. But most importantly, with a Georgia first half ticket and a Georgia full game ticket, hopefully we'll see you at the window.
Thanks for listening to Bet the Board. You can catch Todd and Payne every Monday, Wednesday, and Thursday during football season, breaking down the biggest NFL and college football games. And to make sure you don't miss any free best bets, subscribe to Bet the Board on iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts.